Chapter 10. As time went on, it came to pass that few except the postman mounted Oleron's stairs, and since men who do not write letters receive few, even the postman's tread became so infrequent that it was not heard more than once or twice a week. There came a letter from Oleron's publishers, asking when they might expect to receive the manuscript of his new book. He delayed for some time to answer it, and finally forgot it. A second letter came, which he also failed to answer. He received no third. The weather grew bright and warm. The privet bushes among the chopper-like notice boards flowered, and in the streets where Oleron did his shopping the baskets of flower women lined the curbs. Oleron purchased flowers daily. His room clamoured for flowers, fresh and continually renewed, and Oleron did not stint its demands. Nevertheless, the necessity for going out to buy them began to irk him more and more, and it was with a greater and ever greater sense of relief that he returned home again. He began to be conscious that again his scale of sensation had suffered a subtle change, a change that was not restoration to its former capacity, but an extension and enlarging that once more included terror. It admitted it in an entirely new form. Lux orco, tenebrae Jovi. The name of this terror was agoraphobia. Oleron had begun to dread air and space, and the horror that might pounce upon the unguarded back. Presently he so contrived it that his food and flowers were delivered daily at his door. He rubbed his hands when he had hit upon this expedient. That was better. Now he could please himself whether he went out or not. Quickly he was confirmed in his choice. It became his pleasure to remain immured. But he was not happy, or if he was, his happiness took an extraordinary turn. He fretted discontentedly, could sometimes have wept from mere weakness and misery, and yet he was dimly conscious that he would not have exchanged his sadness for all the noisy mirth of the world outside. And speaking of noise, much noise, now caused him the acutest discomfort. It was hardly more to be endured than that new-born fear that kept him, on the increasingly rare occasions when he did go out, sidling close to walls and feeling friendly railings with his hand. He moved from room to room softly and in slippers, and sometimes stood for many seconds closing a door so gently that not a sound broke the stillness that was in itself a delight. Sunday now became an intolerable day to him, for, since the coming of the fine weather, there had begun to assemble in the square under his windows each Sunday morning certain members of the sect to which the long-nosed Barrett adhered. These came with a great drum and large brass-bellied instruments, men and women uplifted, anguished voices, struggling with their God, and Barrett himself, with upraised face and closed eyes and working brows, prayed that the sound of his voice might penetrate the ears of all unbelievers, as it certainly did Oleron's. One day, in the middle of one of these rhapsodies, Oleron sprang to his blind and pulled it down, and heard as he did so his own name made the subject of a fresh torrent of outpouring. And sometimes, but not as expecting a reply, Oleron stood still and called softly. Once or twice he called "Romilly," and then waited, but more often his whispering did not take the shape of a name. There was one spot in particular of his abode that he began to haunt with increasing persistency. This was just within the opening of his bedroom door. He had discovered one day that by opening every door in his place, always excepting the outer one, which he only opened unwillingly, and by placing himself on this particular spot, he could actually see to a greater or less extent into each of his 5 rooms without changing his position. He could see the whole of his sitting-room, all of his bedroom except the part hidden by the open door, and glimpses of his kitchen, bathroom, and of his rarely used study. He was often in this place, breathless and with his finger on his lip. One day, as he stood there, he suddenly found himself wondering whether this Madley, of whom the vicar had spoken, had ever discovered the strategic importance of the bedroom entry. Light, moreover, now caused him greater disquietude than did darkness. Direct sunlight, of which, as the sun passed daily round the house, each of his rooms now had its share, was like a flame in his brain, and even diffused light was a dull and numbing ache. He began at successive hours of the day, one after another, to lower his crimson blinds. He made short and daring excursions in order to do this, but he was ever careful to leave his retreat open, in case he should have sudden need of it. Presently, this lowering of the blinds had become a daily methodical exercise, and his rooms, when he had been his round, had the blood-red half-light of a photographer's darkroom. One day, as he drew down the blind of his little study and backed in a good order out of the room again, he broke into a soft laugh. "That bilks Mr. Barrett," he said, and the baffling of Barrett continued to afford him mirth for an hour. But on another day, soon after, he had a fright that left him trembling, also for an hour. He had seized the cord to darken the window over the seat in which he had found the harp-bag, and was standing with his back well protected in the embrasure, when he thought he saw the tail of a black and white check skirt disappear round the corner of the house. He could not be sure. He had run to the window of the other wall, which was blinded. The skirt must have already passed, but he was almost sure that it was Elsie. He listened in an agony of suspense for her tread on the stairs. But no tread came, and after 3 or 4 minutes he drew a long breath of relief. "By Jove, but that would have compromised me horribly," he muttered. And he continued to mutter from time to time, "Horribly compromising. No woman would stand that. Not any kind of woman. Oh, compromising in the extreme." Yet he was not happy. He could not have assigned the cause of the fits of quiet weeping which took him sometimes. They came and went, like the fitful illumination of the clouds that travelled over the square, and perhaps, after all, if he was not happy, he was not unhappy. Before he could be unhappy, something must have been withdrawn, and nothing had yet been withdrawn from him, for nothing had been granted. He was waiting for that granting, in that flower-laden, frightfully enticing apartment of his, with the pith-white walls, tinged and subdued by the crimson blinds to a blood-like gloom. He paid no heed to it that his stock of money was running perilously low, not that he had ceased to work. Ceased to work? He had not ceased to work. They knew very little about it who supposed that Oleron had ceased to work. He was in truth only now beginning to work. He was preparing such a work, such a work. Such a mistress was a making in the gestation of his art. Let him but get this period of probation and poignant waiting over, and men should see. How should men know her, this fair one of Oleron's, until Oleron himself knew her? Lovely, radiant creations are not thrown off like how-d'ye-do's. The men to whom it is committed to father them must weep wretched tears, as Oleron did, must swell with vain presumptuous hopes, as Oleron did, must pursue, as Oleron pursued, the capricious, fair, mocking, slippery, eager spirit that, ever eluding, ever sees to it that the chase does not slacken. Let Oleron but hunt this mistress a little longer, he would have her sparkling and panting in his arms yet. Oh no, they were very far from the truth who supposed that Oleron had ceased to work. And if all else was falling away from Oleron, gladly he was letting it go. So do we all when our fair ones beckon. Quite at the beginning, we wink and promise ourselves that we will put her ladyship through her paces, neglect her for a day, turn her own jealous wiles against her, flout and ignore her when she comes wheedling. Perhaps there lurks within us all the time a heartless sprite who is never fooled, but in the end all falls away. She beckons, and all goes. And so Oleron kept his strategic post within the frame of his bedroom door, and watched and waited, and smiled, with his finger on his lips. It was his duteous service, his worship, his troth-plighting, all that he had ever known of love. And when he found himself, as he now and then did, hating the dead man madly, and wishing that he had never lived, he felt that that, too, was an acceptable service. But as he thus prepared himself, as it were, for a marriage, and moped and chafed more and more that the bride made no sign, he made a discovery that he ought to have made weeks before. It was through a thought of the dead madly that he made it. Since that night, when he had thought in his greenness that a little studied neglect would bring the lovely Beckoner to her knees, and had made use of her own jealousy to banish her, he had not set eyes on those 15 discarded chapters of Romilly. He had thrown them back into the window-seat, forgotten their very existence. But his own jealousy of Madley put him in mind of hers, of her jilted rival of flesh and blood, and he remembered them. Fool that he had been! Had he, then, expected his desire to manifest herself while there still existed the evidence of his divided allegiance? What, and she with a passion so fierce and scented that it had not hesitated at the destruction, twice attempted, of her rival? Fool that he had been! But if that was all the pledge and sacrifice she required, she should have it. Ah, yes, and quickly. He took the manuscript from the window-seat and brought it to the fire. He kept his fire always burning now. The warmth brought out the last vestige of odour of the flowers with which his room was banked. He did not know what time it was. Long since he had allowed his clock to run down. It had seemed a foolish measure of time in regard to the stupendous things that were happening to Oleron, but he knew it was late. He took the Romilly manuscript and knelt before the fire. But he had not finished removing the fastening that held the sheets together before he suddenly gave a start, turned his head over his shoulder, and listened intently. The sound he had heard had not been loud. It had been, indeed, no more than a tap, twice or thrice repeated, but it had filled Oleron with alarm. His face grew dark as it came again. He heard a voice outside on his landing. "Paul! Paul!" It was Elsie's voice. "Paul, I know you're in. I want to see you." He cursed her under his breath, but kept perfectly still. He did not intend to admit her. "Paul, you're in trouble. I believe you're in danger. At least come to the door." Oleron smothered a low laugh. It somehow amused him that she, in such danger herself, should talk to him of his danger. Well, if she was, serve her right. She knew, or said she knew, all about it. "Paul! Paul! Paul! Paul!" he mimicked her under his breath. "Oh, Paul, it's horrible!" Horrible, was it? Thought Oleron. Then let her get away. "I only want to help you, Paul. I didn't promise not to come if you needed me." He was impervious to the pitiful sob that interrupted the low cry. The devil take the woman! Should he shout to her to go away and not come back? No, let her call and knock and sob. She had a gift for sobbing. She mustn't think her sobs would move him. They irritated him, so that he set his teeth and shook his fist at her. But that was all. Let her sob. "Paul! Paul!" With his teeth hard set, he dropped the first page of Romilly into the fire. Then he began to drop the rest in, sheet by sheet. For many minutes the calling behind his door continued. Then suddenly it ceased. He heard the sound of feet slowly descending the stairs. He listened for the noise of a fall, or the crash of a piece of the handrail of the upper landing, but none of these things came. She was spared. Apparently her rival suffered her to crawl abject and beaten away. Oleron heard the passing of her steps under his window, then she was gone. He dropped the last page into the fire, and then, with a low laugh, rose. He looked fondly round his room. "Lucky to get away like that," he remarked. "She wouldn't have got away if I'd given her as much as a word or a look. What Devils these women are. But no, I oughtn't to say that. One of them showed forbearance. Who showed forbearance? And what was forborne? Ah, Oleron knew. Contempt, no doubt, had been at the bottom of it, but that didn't matter. The pestering creature had been allowed to go unharmed. Yes, she was lucky. Oleron hoped she knew it. And now for his reward. Oleron crossed the room. All his doors were open. His eyes shone as he placed himself within that of his bedroom. Fool that he had been, not to think of destroying the manuscript sooner. How, in a house full of shadows, should he know his own shadow? How, in a house full of noises, distinguish the summons he felt to be at hand? Ah, trust him! He would know. The place was full of a jugglery of dim lights. The blind at his elbow that allowed the first light of a street lamp to struggle vaguely through, the glimpse of greeny blue moonlight seen through the distant kitchen door, the sultry glow of the fire under the black ashes of the burnt manuscript, the glimmering of the tulips and the moon daisies and narcissi in the bowls and jugs and jars. These did not so trick and bewilder his eyes that he would not know his own. It was he, not she, who had been delaying the shadowy bridal. He hung his head for a moment in mute acknowledgment. Then he bent his eyes on the deceiving, puzzling gloom again. He would have called her name had he known it. But now he would not ask her to share even a name with the other. His own face, within the frame of the door, glimmered white as the narcissi in the darkness. A shadow, light as fleece, seemed to take shape in the kitchen. The time had been when Oleron would have said that a cloud had passed over the unseen moon. The low illumination on the blind at his elbow grew dimmer. The time had been when Oleron would have concluded that the lamplighter going his rounds had turned low the flame of the lamp. The fire settled, letting down the black and charred papers. A flower fell from a bowl and lay indistinct upon the floor. All was still. And then a stray draught moved through the old house, passing before Oleron's face. Suddenly, inclining his head, he withdrew a little from the door-jamb. The wandering draught had caused the door to move a little on its hinges. Oleron trembled violently, stood for a moment longer, and then, putting his hand out to the knob, softly drew the door to, sat down on the nearest chair, and waited, as a man might await the calling of his name, that should summon him to some weighty, high, and privy audience. Chapter 11. One knows not whether there can be human compassion for anemia of the soul. When the pitch of life is dropped, and the spirit is so put over and reversed, that only is horrible which before was sweet and worldly, and of the day, the human relation disappears. The sane soul turns appalled away, lest not merely itself, but sanity should suffer. We are not gods. We cannot drive out devils. We must see selfishly to it that devils do not enter into ourselves. And this we must do, even though love so transfuse us that we may well deem our nature to be half divine. We shall but speak of honour and duty in vain. The letter dropped within the dark door will lie unregarded, or, if regarded for a brief instant between two unspeakable lapses, left and forgotten again. The telegram will be undelivered, nor will the whistling messenger, wiselier guided than he knows to whistle, be conscious as he walks away of the drawn blind that is pushed aside an inch by a finger and then fearfully replaced again. No. Let the miserable wrestle with his own shadows. Let him, if indeed he be so mad, clip and strain and enfold and couch the succubus. But let him do so in a house into which not an air of heaven penetrates, not a bright finger of the sun pierces the filthy twilight. The lost must remain lost. Humanity has other business to attend to. For the handwriting of the two letters that Oleron, stealing noiselessly one June day into his kitchen to rid his sitting-room of an armful of fetid and decaying flowers, has seen on the floor within his door, had had no more meaning for him than if it had belonged to some dim and far-away dream, and at the beating of the telegraph-boy upon the door within a few feet of the bed where he lay, he had gnashed his teeth and stopped his ears. He had pictured the lad standing there, just beyond his partition, among packets of provisions and bundles of dead and dying flowers, for his outer landing was littered with these. Oleron had feared to open his door to take them in. After a week, the errand lad had reported that there must be some mistake about the order, and left no more. Inside, in the red twilight, the old flowers turned brown and fell and decayed where they lay. Gradually his power was draining away. The abomination fastened on Oleron's power. The steady sapping sometimes left him for many hours of prostration, gazing vacantly up at his red-tinged ceiling, idly suffering such fancies as came of themselves to have their way with him. Even the strongest of his memories had no more than a precarious hold upon his attention. Sometimes a flitting half-memory of a novel to be written, a novel it was important that he should write, tantalised him for a space before vanishing again, and sometimes whole novels, perfect, splendid, established to endure, rose magically before him. And sometimes the memories were absurdly remote and trivial, of garrets he had inhabited, and lodgings that had sheltered him, and so forth. Oleron had known a good deal about such things in his time, but all that was now past. He had at last found a place which he did not intend to leave until they fetched him out, a place that some might have thought a little on the green-sick side, that others might have considered to be a little too redolent of long-dead and morbid things for a living man to be mewed up in. But so irresistible, with such an authority of its own, with such an associate of its own, and a place of such delights when once a man had ceased to struggle against its inexorable will. A novel? Somebody ought to write a novel about a place like that. There must be lots to write about in a place like that, if one could but get to the bottom of it. It had probably already been painted, by a man called Madley who had lived there, but Oleron had not known this Madley, had a strong feeling that he wouldn't have liked him, would rather he had lived somewhere else. Really couldn't stand the fellow. Hated him, Madley, in fact. That was a joke. He seriously doubted whether the man had led the life he ought. Oleron was in two minds sometimes whether he wouldn't tell that long-nosed guardian of the public morals across the way about him, but probably he knew, and had made his praying hullabaloos for him also. That was his line. Why, Oleron himself had had a dust-up with him about something or other. Some girl or other. Elsie Bengough, her name was. He remembered. Oleron had moments of deep uneasiness about this Elsie Bengough, or rather, he was not so much easy about her as restless about the things she did. Chief of these was the way in which she persisted in thrusting herself into his thoughts, and, whenever he was quick enough, he sent her packing the moment she made her appearance there. The truth was that she was not merely a bore, she had always been that. It had now come to the pitch when her very presence in his fancy was inimical to the full enjoyment of certain experiences. She had no tact. Really ought to have known that people are not at home to the thoughts of everybody all the time, ought in mere politeness to have allowed him certain seasons quite to himself, and was monstrously ignorant of things if she did not know, as she appeared not to know, that there were certain special hours when a man's veins ran with fire and daring and power, in which he had a reasonable right to treat folk as he had treated that prying Barrett, to shut them out completely. But no, up she popped the very thought of her, and ruined all. Bright towering fabrics, by the side of which even those perfect magical novels of which he dreamed were dun and grey, vanished utterly at her intrusion. It was as if a fog should suddenly quench some fair beaming star, as if at the threshold of some golden portal prepared for Oleron a pit should suddenly gape, as if bat-like shadow should turn the glowing dawn to murk and darkness again. Therefore Oleron strived to stifle even the nascent thought of her. Nevertheless, there came an occasion on which this woman Bengough absolutely refused to be suppressed. Oleron could not have told exactly when this happened. He only knew by the glimmer of the street lamp on his blind that it was some time during the night, and that for some time she had not presented herself. He had no warning, none of her coming. She just came, was there. Strive as he would, he could not shake off the thought of her, nor the image of her face. She haunted him. But for her to come at that moment of all moments, really it was past belief. How she could endure it, Oleron could not conceive. Actually, to look on, as it were, at the triumph of a rival, good God, it was monstrous. Tact? Reticence? He had never credited her with an overwhelming amount of either, but he had never attributed mere, oh, there was no word for it. Monstrous, monstrous. Did she intend thenceforward, good God, to look on? Oleron felt the blood rush up to the roots of his hair with anger against her. Damnation take her, he choked. But the next moment his heat and resentment had changed to a cold sweat of cowering fear. Panic-stricken, he strove to comprehend what he had done, for though he knew not what, he knew he had done something fatal, irreparable, lasting. Anger he had felt, but not this blaze of ire that suddenly flooded the twilight of his consciousness with a white infernal light. That appalling flash was not his, that open rift of bright and searing hell. Not his. His had been the hand of a child, preparing a puny blow. But what was this other, horrific hand that was drawn back to strike in the same place? Had he set that in motion? Had he provided the spark that had touched off the whole accumulated power of that formidable and relentless place? He did not know. He only knew that a poor igniting particle in himself was blown out, that, oh, impossible, a clinging kiss, how else to express it, had changed on his very lips to a gnashing and a removal, and that, for very pity of the awful odds, he must cry out to her against whom he had lately raged to guard herself. "Look out!" he shrieked aloud. The revulsion was instant. As if a cold, slow billow had broken over him, he came to find that he was lying in his bed, that the mist and horror that had for so long enwrapped him had departed, that he was poor Oleron, and that he was sick, naked, helpless, and utterly abandoned and alone. His faculties, though weak, answered at last to his calls upon them, and he knew that it must have been a hideous nightmare that had left him sweating and shaking thus. Yes, he was himself, Paul Oleron, a tired novelist, already past the summit of his best work, and slipping downhill again empty-handed from it all. He had struck short in his life's aim. He had tried too much, had overestimated his strength, and was a failure. A failure. It all came to him in a single word, enwrapped and complete. It needed no sequential thought. He was a failure. He had missed. And he had missed not one happiness, but two. He had missed the ease of this world, which men love, and he had missed also that other shining prize for which men forego ease, the snatching and holding and triumphant bearing up aloft of which is the only justification of the mad adventurer who hazards the enterprise. And there was no second attempt. Fate has no morrow. Oleron's morrow must be to sit down to profitless, ill-done, unrequired work again, and so on the morrow after that, and the morrow after that, and as many morrows as there might be. He lay there, weakly yet sanely considering it. And since the whole attempt had failed, it was hardly worth while to consider whether a little might not be saved from the general wreck. No good would ever come of that half-finished novel. He had intended that it should appear in the autumn, was under contract that it should appear. No matter. It was better to pay forfeit to his publishers than to waste what days were left. He was spent. Age was not far off, and paths of wisdom and sadness were the properest for the remainder of the journey. If only he had chosen the wife, the child, the faithful friend at the fireside, and let them follow an ignis fatuus that list. In the meantime, it began to puzzle him exceedingly why he should be so weak, that his room should smell so overpoweringly of decaying vegetable matter, and that his hand, chancing to stray to his face in the darkness, should encounter a beard. Most extraordinary, he began to mutter to himself. Have I been ill? Am I ill now? And if so, why have they left me alone? Extraordinary. He thought he heard a sound from the kitchen or bathroom. He rose a little on his pillow and listened. Ah, he was not alone then. It certainly would have been extraordinary if they had left him ill and alone. Alone? Oh no, he would be looked after. He wouldn't be left ill to shift for himself. If everybody else had forgotten him, he could trust Elsie Bengough, the dearest chum he had, for that. Bless her faithful heart. But suddenly a short, stifled, spluttering cry rang sharply out. Paul! It came from the kitchen, and in the same moment it flashed upon Oleron, he knew not how, that 2, 3, 5, he knew not how many minutes before, another sound, unmarked at the time, but suddenly transfixing his attention now, had striven to reach his intelligence. This sound had been the slight touch of metal on metal, just such a sound as Oleron made when he put his key into the lock. "Hello! Who's that?" he called sharply from his bed. He had no answer. He called again. "Hello! Who's there? Who is it?" This time he was sure he heard noises, soft and heavy, in the kitchen. "This is a queer thing altogether," he muttered. "By Jove, I'm as weak as a kitten, too. Hello there! Somebody called, didn't they? Elsie, is that you?" Then he began to knock with his hand on the wall at the side of his bed. "Elsie! Elsie! You called, didn't you? Please come here, whoever it is." There was a sound as of a closing door, and then silence. Oleron began to get rather alarmed. "It may be a nurse," he muttered. "Elsie'd have to get me a nurse, of course. She'd sit with me as long as she could spare the time, brave lass, and she'd get a nurse for the rest. But it was awfully like her voice. Elsie, or whoever it is, I can't make this out at all. I must go and see what's the matter." He put one leg out of bed. Feeling its feebleness, he reached with his hand for the additional support of the wall. But before putting out the other leg he stopped and considered, picking at his new-found beard. He was suddenly wondering whether he dared go into the kitchen. It was such a frightfully long way. No man knew what horror might not leap and huddle on his shoulders if he went so far. When a man has an overmastering impulse to get back into bed, he ought to take heed of the warning and obey it. Besides, why should he go? What was there to go for? If it was that Bengough creature again, let her look after herself. Oleron was not going to have such things cramp themselves on his defenceless back for the sake of such a spoil-sport as she. If she was in, let her let herself out again, and the sooner the better for her. Oleron simply couldn't be bothered. He had his work to do. On the morrow, he must set about the writing of a novel with a heroine so winsome, capricious, adorable, jealous, wicked, beautiful, inflaming, and altogether evil, that men should stand amazed. She was coming over him now. He knew by the alteration of the very air of the room when she was near him, and that soft thrill of bliss that had begun to stir in him never came unless she was beckoning. He let go the wall and fell back into bed again as, oh, unthinkable, the other half of that kiss that a gnash had interrupted was placed, how else convey it, on his lips, robbing him of very breath. Chapter 12. In the bright June sunlight a crowd filled the square, and looked up at the windows of the old house with the antique insurance marks in its walls of red brick, and the agents' notice boards hanging like wooden choppers over the paling. 2 constables stood at the broken gate of the narrow entrance alley, keeping folk back. The women kept to the outskirts of the throng, moving now and then as if to see the drawn red blinds of the old house from a new angle, and talking in whispers. The children were in the houses, behind closed doors. A long-nosed man had a little group about him, and he was telling some story over and over again, and another man, little and fat and wide-eyed, sought to capture the long-nosed man's audience with some relation in which a key figured. "And it was revealed to me that there'd been something that very afternoon," the long-nosed man was saying. "I was standing there where Constable Saunders is, or rather, I was passing about my business, when they came out. There was no deceiving me, oh, no deceiving me. I saw her face." "What was it like, Mr. Barrett?" a man asked. "It was like hers whom our Lord said to, 'Woman, doth any man accuse thee?' White as paper, and no mistake." "Don't tell me." "And so I walks straight across to Mrs. Barrett, and 'Jane,' I says, 'this must stop, and stop at once. We are commanded to avoid evil,' I says, 'and must come to an end now. Let him get help elsewhere.' And she says to me, 'John,' she says, 'it's 4 and 6pence a week.' Them was her words. 'Jane,' I says, 'if it was £46,000 it should stop,' and from that day to this she hasn't set foot inside that gate." There was a short silence then. "Did Mrs. Barrett ever see anything like?" somebody vaguely inquired. Barrett turned austerely on the speaker. "What Mrs. Barrett saw and Mrs. Barrett didn't see shall not pass these lips, even as it is written, 'Keep thy tongue from speaking evil,'" he said. Another man spoke. "He was pretty near canned up in the waggon and horses that night, weren't he, Jim?" "Yes, he hadn't half copped it." "Not standing treat much, neither. He was in the bar, all on his own." "So he was. We talked about it." The fat, scared-eyed man made another attempt. "She got the key off me. She 'ad the number of it. She come into my shop of a Tuesday evening." Nobody heeded him. "Shut your heads," a heavy labourer commented gruffly. "She hasn't been found yet. Here's the inspector. We shall know more in a bit." 2 inspectors had come up and were talking to the constables who guarded the gate. The little fat man ran eagerly forward, saying that she had bought the key of him. "I remember the number, because of its being 3 1s and 3 3s. 111 333, he exclaimed excitedly. An inspector put him aside. "Nobody's been in?" he asked of one of the constables. "No, sir." "Then you, Brackley, come with us. You, Smith, keep the gate. There's a squad on its way." The 2 inspectors and the constable passed down the alley and entered the house. They mounted the wide carved staircase. "This don't look as if he'd been out much lately," one of the inspectors muttered as he kicked aside a litter of dead leaves and paper that lay outside Oleron's door. "I don't think we need knock. Break a pane, Brackley." The door had 2 glazed panels. There was a sound of shattered glass, and Brackley put his hand through the hole his elbow had made and drew back the latch. "Phew!" choked one of the inspectors as they entered. "Let some light and air in, quick! It stinks like a hearse!" The assembly out in the square saw the red blinds go up, and the windows of the old house flung open. "That's better," said one of the inspectors, putting his head out of a window and drawing a deep breath. "That seems to be the bedroom in there. Will you go in, Sims, while I go over the rest?" They had drawn up the bedroom blind also, and the waxy white, emaciated man on the bed had made a blinker of his hand against the torturing flood of brightness. Nor could he believe that his hearing was not playing tricks with him, for there were 2 policemen in his room, bending over him and asking where she was. He shook his head. "This woman, Bengough, goes by the name of Miss Elsie Bengough. D'ye hear? Where is she?" "No good, Brackley. Get him up. Be careful with him. I'll just shove my head out the window, I think." The other inspector had been through Oleron's study and had found nothing, and was now in the kitchen, kicking aside an ankle-deep mass of vegetable refuse that cumbered the floor. The kitchen window had no blind, and was overshadowed by the blank end of the house across the alley. The kitchen appeared to be empty. But the inspector, kicking aside the dead flowers, noticed that a shuffling track that was not of his making had been swept to a cupboard in the corner. In the upper part of the door of the cupboard was a square panel that looked as if it slid on runners. The door itself was closed. The inspector advanced, put out his hand to the little knob, and slid the hatch along its groove. Then he took an involuntary step back again. Framed in the aperture, and falling forward a little before it jammed again in its frame, was something that resembled a large, lumpy pudding, done up in a pudding bag of faded browny red frieze. "Ah," said the inspector. To close the hatch again, he would have had to thrust that pudding back with his hand, and somehow he did not quite like the idea of touching it. Instead, he turned the handle of the cupboard itself. There was weight behind it, so much weight that, after opening the door 3 or 4 inches and peering inside, he had to put his shoulder to it in order to close it again. In closing it, he left sticking out, a few inches from the floor, a triangle of black and white check skirt. He went into the small hall. "All right," he called. They had gotten Oleron into his clothes. He still used his hands as blinkers, and his brain was very confused. A number of things were happening that he couldn't understand. He couldn't understand the extraordinary mess of dead flowers there seemed to be everywhere. He couldn't understand why there should be police officers in his room. He couldn't understand why one of these should be sent for a 4-wheeler and a stretcher. And he couldn't understand what heavy article they seemed to be moving about in the kitchen. His kitchen. "What's the matter?" he muttered sleepily. Then he heard a murmur in the square, and the stopping of a 4-wheeler outside. A police officer was at his elbow again, and Oleron wondered why, when he whispered something to him, he should run off a string of words. Something about "used in evidence against you." They had lifted him to his feet, and were assisting him towards the door. No, Oleron couldn't understand it at all. They got him down the stairs and along the alley. Oleron was aware of confused, angry shoutings. He gathered that a number of people wanted to lynch somebody or other. Then his attention became fixed on a little fat, frightened-eyed man who appeared to be making a statement that an officer was taking down in a notebook. "I'd seen her with him. They was often together. She came into my shop and said it was for him. I thought it was all right. 111-333 the number was," the man was saying. The people seemed to be very angry. Many police were keeping them back, but one of the inspectors had a voice that Oleron thought quite kind and friendly. He was telling somebody to get somebody else into the cab before something or other was brought out, and Oleron noticed that a 4-wheeler was drawn up at the gate. It appeared that it was himself who was to be put into it, and as they lifted him up, he saw that the inspector tried to stand between him and something that stood behind the cab. But he was not quick enough to prevent Oleron seeing that this something was a hooded stretcher. The angry voices sounded like a sea. Something hard, like a stone, hit the back of the cab, and the inspector followed Oleron in and stood with his back to the window nearer the side where the people were. The door they had put Oleron in at remained open, apparently till the other inspector should come, and through the opening Oleron had a glimpse of the hatchet-like "To Let" boards among the privet trees. One of them said that the key was at number 6. Suddenly the raging of voices was hushed. Along the entrance alley shuffling steps were heard, and the other inspector appeared at the cab door. "Right away," he said to the driver. He entered, fastened the door after him, and blocked up the second window with his back. Between the two inspectors, Oleron slept peacefully. The cab moved down the square. The other vehicle went up the hill. The mortuary lay that way. This is the end of chapter 12 of The Beckoning Fair One by Oliver Onions. And this is the end of The Beckoning Fair One. Recorded by Morgan Scorpion.